Hello and welcome to Tête à Tête, France 24's flagship interview show. Our guest today is Dennis Ross. He's a former U.S. Middle East chief negotiator. He's now a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he joins us from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much, Mr. Ross.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
President Biden said it's time to end the war in Gaza. He spelled out a couple of days ago the outlines of a hostage and ceasefire deal, presenting it as Israel's offer. This plan has now been endorsed by the United Nations Security Council in a resolution. We'll see if this works. But even if there is an agreement in principle, do you think that this can stop the war for good?
I don't know if it can stop the war for good because you really have a kind of zero-sum reality. The Israelis want to make sure that at the end of this war, Hamas is no longer in control of Gaza. Hamas can never again threaten Israel. Hamas wants to retain its position in Gaza. It wants to end the war in a way that gives it a chance to reconstitute itself and rebuild. Israel wants to be sure that it can't recover and can't rebuild. So the key here is coming up with a way to define an end point that the Israelis can accept, and Hamas may believe, okay, we're not in a great position, but maybe we'll find a way back. That's the only way I think you get a negotiated outcome here, unless there's such pressure on Hamas that Hamas decides that it needs to see an end, and we'll figure out a way later on to try to come back.
Right. Obviously, there is also tensions within the ruling coalition. In Israel, Benny Gantz decided to leave the war cabinet. The far-right ministers, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, have threatened to essentially thwart this agreement. You wrote a while ago that Netanyahu will have to choose between Biden and Ben-Gvir. Has this moment arrived?
I think we're getting close to such a moment because I think Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are threatening to leave the government if Prime Minister Netanyahu were to agree to a hostage deal based on the proposal that, in fact, the war cabinet allowed the U.S. to provide to both Egypt and Qatar to convey to Hamas. Now, that proposal is what the president then, on May 31, published by giving a speech. And again, both Ben-Gvir and Smotrich said they would leave the government if the prime minister acted on that. So if Hamas were prepared to accept it, and at this point there is very little indication that they will, one of the things we've seen them do is they've come back with what they say is a positive response, but it looks like it's once again a counter proposal to what the United States had the Security Council adopt. So I don't know that we're close to reaching an agreement. I suspect there'll be some effort to see if there's a way to bridge the differences. Netanyahu is already in a position where what he authorized went too far for Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. If there's a way to bridge the differences, I think it's very hard for Netanyahu under those circumstances to say no. And that could be the point at which basically he has to choose Biden over Ben-Gvir.
Right. What do you make of the departure of Benny Gantz from the war cabinet in the middle of all this?
Well, I think that, excuse me, what happened with Benny Gantz and with Gadi Eisenkot was they came in at the very beginning after October 7th because they saw the country needed them. Prime Minister at that point was largely in a state of shock, and he needed them, two former military chiefs of staff, to come in and help create stability. I think for the first couple of months they had influence. I think over the last few months they felt they did not. So they were not prepared to stay in a war cabinet where they saw no clear strategy for what came next, where they weren't completely satisfied with the approach on the hostages, and where they also were unhappy with, at a time when there's a huge manpower gap for Israel in terms of what they need facing all the current threats militarily, they felt there needed to be a new legislation, new draft law, so that the ultra-religious would also have to at least assume some role in terms of national service. And the current, I think, the coalition between the prime minister and the religious parties has basically precluded that. So they left because they felt they weren't having influence any longer, number one. Number two, I think they also feel that there's a need coming up on October 7th, the 1-year anniversary of that. There's been no accountability for what happened on October 7th. By the way, it's one of the reasons when you're in Israel, the Israeli public is living as if this is still October 7th, partly because of the hostages, which are a daily reminder, partly because there's been no explanation for why the performance is surprised. They understand why the IDF seems so unprepared, at least for the first day or so after October 7th, and partly because there's been no accountability at either the political or the military level for what happened on October 7th, really the worst day in Israel's history. So I think they left for all these reasons. The problem for Netanyahu is now he has no real cover from Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and I think the making decisions will become harder, not easier.
Right. You've been in Israel for a few weeks now. You obviously have a long experience in the neighborhood. You talk to everyone. Is this your sense, as Gantz indicated and others have criticized, that there's no Israeli plan for the day after, that Gaza is a huge question mark and that there's no planning?
I think the irony is that there may be a lot of planning. There's just no decisions made about them. I've spoken to lots of different groups within the Israeli government who are doing planning, but I don't see any decisions made related to that. Look, you had the Secretary of State here 2 days ago, and one of the issues he was raising was, what's your approach to what comes next? The administration has developed an approach. They are talking about some kind of international task force. There really should be a meeting of the minds between the administration and the prime minister and his government over how you get to that next stage, what would constitute winning, meaning Israel is pretty close to completing the dismantling of Hamas as a military. They're really no longer a military, an organized military, but they're back to being a militia and engaging in an insurgency. So can success be the dismantling of Hamas as a military on the one hand, and making sure that it cannot reconstitute itself on the other, meaning there need to be real answers to what happens on the Egyptian-Gazan border so you can't have smuggling that allows them to rebuild. There need to be real answers for if there's going to be reconstruction. In the UN Security Council proposal resolution based on the Israeli proposal, the third phase is supposed to be reconstruction. Well, what mechanisms need to be created to ensure that Hamas can't divert the materials so that they're able to rebuild and reconstitute themselves? So what mechanisms also exist to cut Hamas off from monies? So if Hamas doesn't have a military any longer, and if Israel has dismantled enough of its military infrastructure, meaning weapons depots, weapons labs, production sites, and they can't get materials, they can't get money, and they can't get arms, well, then you are pretty much succeeding in terms of guaranteeing that they can't be a threat again and they can't reconstitute themselves. You still will need an alternative to Hamas. If you leave a vacuum, they have a chance to come back. So here, there really is no answer on the Israeli side at this point. And on the American side, there is, I think, some general notions, but there's a real lack of specificity. That should be a focus of discussions between the two.
Right. Biden told Time magazine recently that there is, quote, every reason to draw the conclusion that Netanyahu is prolonging the war for personal political survival. From what you just said, is this the feeling that people are getting in Israel and that you personally have?
Well, there certainly is a majority of people in Israel, if you look at the polling, who believe that his decisions are being guided by political considerations. If you look at the polling, there's a majority of Israelis who believe that. I don't know the answer to it. To be honest, I don't know the answer to it. Is he maneuvering to keep the coalition? Is that what's guiding the decisions? Is there a level of uncertainty about how to define what comes next? What's clear is there doesn't seem to be a day after, or what I even call a days before strategy before you get to the day after. That's necessary. I think the Biden administration should be focused on that. They had very useful discussions on the issue of Rafah and came to some understanding about how Israel would go after Rafah, go into Rafah to deal with the battalions that were there, the Hamas battalions. Why isn't there a conversation on let's define how much is enough to declare victory, number one. Let's focus on what Israel then asks of the United States to produce to ensure Hamas, there can't be any smuggling any longer, there can't be diversion of materials, they can't get weapons, materials, and money, and let's talk about what the alternative is so there isn't a vacuum. So that, I think, is an essential part of the discussion. If the Prime Minister isn't presenting this, the having to have a discussion with the U.S. is one way to get at it.
Dennis Ross, that's all we had time for. I want to thank you very much for being our guest here on France 24 from Tel Aviv. Thank you all for watching this show.